So it was kind of neat getting on the airplane, and I used to love my titanium because of the way it was styled and looked, but the aluminum's pretty good. So I put the aluminum, I took it out of my backpack and put it in the bin at the airport, and the x-ray lady said, "Wow, that's a good computer." I don't even think she knew what it was, but something about it gave that away. Well, I'm going to go back in some early computer days and then trace through a little Apple history later on. Back, electronics and computers and all that started for me back in elementary school, inspired by books where engineers were heroes, and I happened to read some of those. And I lived in an area where the orchards were coming down in Santa Clara Valley, and it was turning into Silicon Valley, and Fairchild and a few other transistor companies were just starting up, and there were a lot of engineers moving into the area. And there were a lot of electronics kids in the neighborhood that would get parts at the local store, and we'd do odd jobs like taking care of the gardens of neighbors if we got paid in parts, that sort of thing. So, now, somehow I had a father who was an engineer, and that helped, and he helped me in a lot more ways than electronics. But by 5th grade, I read a book and decided I wanted to be a ham radio operator. So I actually home built my own kit, soldered together all the tubes and the resistors and they didn't have transistors and diodes really in those things back then. The capacitors, the tuning dials, all that stuff. Got a ham radio license. So I had an early start and moved into logic circuits by 6th grade and built tic-tac-toe computer with hundreds of parts. So I had an early start. I didn't know that this would ever be a sort of a job. I just knew I liked electronics. I want to do electronics in my life, whatever it amounts to. We'd build house-to-house intercoms in our neighborhood. We had a whole bunch of electronics kids. We'd get walkie-talkies and communications receivers, and we were into that whole world. It starts out with your first crystal radio and builds up through more kits. In 6th grade, I got a transistor radio. This was just the most beautiful thing I'd ever gotten in my life, a blue transistor radio, and it was from Japan, and I sat there probably for the next 10 years. I had music on all night long while I slept, just a big part of my life. I told my dad, he was working on some satellites at Lockheed, and they were getting so many transistors in smaller space, and he was talking about chips. Some companies were about to make the first chips and put more than one transistor on a chip so they could pack them even tighter. And I said, oh, so they could make even smaller transistor radios. And he said, no, they make them for the military, and then what falls out, that's what people get. As a kid, it bothered me, and to this day, still, doggone it. It seems like consumer electronics products that people use in their own homes and their own lives, that ought to be pushing the technology. Well, my dad also, gave me real positive values about education, made me feel good that the newer generation is going to learn from the prior generation's mistakes and really help clean up a world that needed a lot of cleaning up. It made me feel good. And he said teachers are the most important people in your life. And, and I said, well, teachers, do they make more than engineers? He said, no. I said, well, elementary school teachers make the most, right? No. So that was interesting learning, but I really did always value education. I thought that I had good schools. I loved going to class. I thought the teachers were smart, and a lot of people I go back and talk to didn't really feel the same way. In junior high school, I got a chance to take my logic circuits a little further and build a calculating device, an adder subtractor in binary with a bunch of switches and lights, and you could toggle in some binary numbers and see a result, and it was kind of cool, and it got me a lot of places. And then by high school, my electronics teacher in high school knew that I knew all the electronics because I'd sort of self-taught myself all this stuff, and he said, you could go down to Sylvania and program a computer. Well, back in those days, we didn't have computers in our high school. And computers were just a rare device. You didn't think you'd ever see one in your life. I get to go down and program a computer. I bought a Fortran book and learned Fortran and went down and programmed it. Once a week I got to go down and program a computer because an engineer was willing to give up a little time and let me. And it was so helpful. The first program I wrote was the Knight's Tour, where the knight on a chessboard hits every square. And no outputs came out. So the next week I started printing out the chessboards, and it was doing exactly the right thing. And then I calculated it was going to take 10 to the 25th years to reach a solution. And I thought the first time in my life, I am the master, I am in control of a machine that does 1,000,000 things a second. But it's going to take 10 to the 25th years to solve. So you know what? Some solutions need a lot more than just raw power of a machine. Well, I stumbled on some computer manuals, and I already had been doing logic and designing some logic things on my own. So I took the early chips that came out where you'd have one gate on a chip, and I started saying, how do I design this computer from Digital Equipment Corporation? And I started working out on pieces of paper, and every once in a while I'd get a free weekend, and I would go back to the computer designs because this was my fun thing in life. It was my pastime. It's what I did when I wasn't getting paid for it, I wasn't getting accredited for it, I wasn't getting any school grades. I wasn't getting a salary. I didn't get nice clothes, a fancy title. Nobody even knew I did it. I just did it for fun. Everyone has these things, you know, usually hobbies and the like. So I would design computers, and I got manuals for Varian computers, Hewlett-Packard computers, Data General computers, and digital computers, and I would design my own versions of them. And after about a year, I was having some free weekends. What'll I do this weekend? Well, there's some newer, better chips out. So I would go back and redesign the computers with the newer, better chips. And for some reason, when you do this over and over, all on your own, independently in your own room, it comes to you, you've got to try to beat your prior designs. There has to be a goal. Your head makes up a goal. So the goal was to compete with myself and do designs better and better. And I started instantly seeing ways to combine all sorts of different gates, ands and ors and exclusive ors, and redo them with another set of gates that was different but gets the same result out, or use some chips to simulate the gates instead and use fewer parts. The fewer parts I used, the better my design was. So it was like a little competition. Every time I designed a computer, how can I do it in the fewest chips? I started coming up with little tricks that I knew were better than almost any human being would ever come up with, and my designs were getting down to about half as many chips as they actually shipped the computers with from companies. So I knew they were pretty good. Well, one day, the Data General Nova computer got introduced. And in the brochure, I looked at its instruction set, and it was weird. All the other computers had 50 instructions that could do different things, one after another after another. You know, add these two numbers, put this into a register, shift it. 50 instructions. The Data General computer, the Nova, had one instruction with 2 little bits meant put this as one input, 2 little bits meant this is another input, 3 bits said whether to add it or AND it or exclusive OR it or whatever you're going to do, and 1 for the carry and 1 for this and shit. And you know, by combining all those bits up, you could get different instructions, many different instructions that the other computers had. And that was a very strange approach. So I had one Saturday free, and I sat down and started designing this Data General Nova. By the time I was done, it was half as many chips as any of the other computers, the mini computers of the day. Half as many chips. How could this be? How could an equivalent computer take half as many chips? It was just beautiful the way the computer had been architected around the chips that existed to flow into a nice design. And that taught me, if you're in control of designing a computer, you should design it around the chips that exist to minimize the total part count and wind up with an equivalent computer. Don't just come up with your own idea of what your processor should be. Headed off to my first year of college, and computers were not taught in college back then. There were very few colleges that had undergraduate computer courses. So the Introduction to Computers class was a graduate level class. And I was a freshman, but I was in engineering, so I was allowed to take it. And I took my first computer class, and I got an A+, but had a little problem. I got put on probation for computer abuse. I thought, wow, the first time in my life, I mean, I have a real computer and I can write all the programs I want to. What do computers do? It was still in my head that the main thing computers do is calculate numbers. I didn't really know how computers were used in the real world, so I looked in my handbook of chemistry and physics and I picked out several different tables of numbers and wrote 7 programs to calculate 60 pages worth of numbers, punch out some cards. I'd put the program in again at noontime, punch them, and it would print the next 60 pages, and at dinner time, print the next 60. 3 times a day, times 7 programs, times 60 pages each, piling up reams and reams of output in my dorm room. And then they cut me off, and the professor called me in, and he tape recorded our conversation, and in front of me, he called the computer department and said, Mr. Wozniak should pay this amount. And it was 5 times over the class budget. And it was like a year's tuition at a very expensive college. So I didn't want my parents to find out, so I didn't try going back there. And now I realize he was just getting out of the money and they wouldn't really have billed me, but it was fun. And that was a good year for fun and electronics because I was good at building electronic circuits and all that, and I had radio experience. So I built a little TV jammer, tiny little circuit you hold in your hand, and you dial it just right, and the TV picture would get fuzzed up on a color TV. So we didn't have very many color TVs back in 1968, so I went over to a girls' dorm, Libby Hall, University of Colorado, and they had the color TV there. People are in the room watching, and it's dark, and I tuned in my little jammer, and the picture got fuzzed up a little. And without any planning, a friend of mine in the front row just hit the TV. And he knew what I was doing, but he hit the TV, and I made it go good. This is the start of, that was the start when I switched my major from engineering to psychology for a couple of weeks, for a short period. So after a while, he'd hit it harder and harder and get it to work, and then he wouldn't hit it, somebody else would go up and start hitting the TV, and for 2 weeks, they stationed someone next to the TV. Whenever it went bad, it was his job to whack it or tune the fine tuning until it worked. And one day I caught a guy with his hand on the middle of the screen, and I made the set go good, made it go good. And there were 3 guys up there trying to fix the TV. Made it go good, and they said, it's good now, it's good now. And they all relaxed, and he brought his hand back down, and the set went bad. They said, freeze, wherever your bodies were, get your bodies back. And after a little while, he put his hand back on the screen, and it went good. And he pulled his hand away, and it went bad. They put it on the screen, and then his foot was up on the air on a chair. So he put his foot down on the ground, and it went bad. And he put his foot up, and it went good. And he turned around to the audience, and he announced, it's a grounding effect. I had other fun with the TV jammer that year, but I don't have to go into that now. I've done it many times. So after that year, the next year I was having a good year at college at Cupertino, and I designed a computer of my own. What happened was during the summer I went to go see a Data General Nova, the computer that I told my father I am going to own a 4K Data General Nova someday. Why 4K? And I said, because that's enough to run Fortran. Well, how are you going to pay for it? It costs as much as a house. Oh, I'll get an apartment. But anyway, I got to see this beautiful computer that I loved so much, and I went down, I walked in the wrong door, and there I was with a glass cage around a medium scale computer that they were building and designing it was a new computer at a company. Oh my gosh. So I filled out an application with my friend, and we got jobs programming for the summer. And I decided to program for a year before my 3rd year of college. And during that stay, I told one of the engineers how I used to design all my own computers. And I could never get companies to give me the chips to build them. And he made a couple phone calls and got me enough chips for a quick little design that I whipped out. And got the chips and even 256 bytes of RAM, and built this little board with switches and lights, and you push some buttons and things go into memory, and you switch some more switches, and you can finally run a program if you get enough of a program in memory. And it worked, and we built it down the street, and every night we drank cream soda for a couple of weeks, and we called it the Cream Soda Computer. And Bill Fernandez, whose garage I built it in, introduced me to another fellow from Homestead High School, Steve Jobs. He said, the two of you have a lot in common. You like electronics, and you like having fun and pranks at high school. Because I'd done a few of mine. So Steve and I met, and we just talked electronics, and we talked music, and we had so many things, that we had in common and liked to talk about. But we were different personalities. And Steve was more of a barefooted hippie, eating raisins, and I was just kind of like a central, real middle of the road. My father had taught me about the extremes, and be in the middle is the best. And so I had my feet on the ground, and Steve would wander off, not knowing where he was going, and I had to always know where I was. But we got along really well because we both knew electronics pretty well. And so then, anyway, while I was at my 2nd year of college, a friend of mine had copied the key to the computer room. So we would go in at midnight and run programs, never doing anything damaging or anything, run programs and debugging programs, big, huge ones, and just had a really good time that year learning things. And it was just like, I loved computers. I took classes even for ones in computers even that didn't carry transfer credit to Berkeley where I would go. So I finally Went to Berkeley for my third year of college and had some nice fun times there with electronics and blue boxes and these devices that make free phone calls. And after that, but the same night that I met Captain Crunch, the most famous boxer there was, hadn't even been caught by the FBI yet. They didn't even know who he was, maybe. We got to meet him in college that year, and he told us all these codes. The very night I met him, I totaled my car, and I really wanted to go back to school with a car again. So I decided I'll take off after my third year of college and work another year to earn money for my fourth year of college and a car. And somehow I very quickly wound up getting a job at Hewlett-Packard. Now, Hewlett-Packard had recently come out in the early 70s with the first scientific calculator, the HP 35. And this was like the most prized possession that I had. I actually had one, even though it was rather expensive. But I was the slide rule champion in high school, and this was the calculator that was going to eliminate slide rules forever. And it was an engineer's dream. So this was the greatest product. And then somehow by a contact, and they brought me in for an interview, even though I didn't have a college degree, I got a job designing calculators at Hewlett-Packard. It's like if you loved Apple computers so much, and then you got to actually work in the company, it'd be so incredible a thing in your life. Well, Hewlett-Packard was a great company. In my mind, it stood for engineers. They made good engineering test equipment, designed and built for and by engineers. And they cared. Like, we were the ones who came up with the ideas for the future products. And what a great company that was to work with, and designing calculators, the most incredible product ever. Well, even though sometimes when you go to work in engineering, you come home, you just want to get away from it, turn on the TV, drink a beer, whatever. For me, I came home and I wanted to do other types of electronics, little side projects. And people started knowing that I was a good designer and could design almost anything real quickly. And I wound up getting into a diverse set of projects that almost always related to fun entertainment in the home, consumer electronics in your home. Well, one of them was actually hotel movies. But it was kind of neat to be able to be involved with one of the very first systems. These were before movies were in hotels. And to get involved with satellite TV before any satellite TV receivers were sold, before they even had encryption on what was up in the air. Get involved with the early VCRs before Sony. The first company that made VCRs on the commercial for people to buy was a United States company called Cartravision. They went bankrupt real quickly. They were going to build them into some Sears TVs, and they were color VCRs. We could buy them surplus for $60. I would get groups of engineers at Hewlett-Packard, and we'd drive down to a place in San Jose where they copied the software on tapes and copied the TV programs, the video programs on tape. And we would buy these VCRs, took them home, studied it, went through the schematics, and learned more about color VCRs, and saw how they a lot of the methods by which they were recorded by the head that spun around. Wound up getting projects from friends to design home pinball games, and eventually Steve Jobs got a job at Atari. And before he went to Atari, I had seen Pong in a bowling alley, the first video game that really sold massively. Pong, and I sat there looking at this little ball on a little screen, bing, 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 a little square dot of light bouncing around. And I sat there with my fiance and I said, oh my God, I could build that, because I know TV signals from high school and I know how to design digital circuitry. So I sat down and I designed a Pong with very few chips and got it to work, and that was cool. And Atari offered me a job, and I said, no way, never leave Hewlett-Packard. And eventually Steve got this deal from Nolan Bushnell at Atari, wanted a single player version of Pong called Breakout. So Steve said, we got to design it. Okay, will you design it? I said, sure, I could do it. He said, well, we have to do it in 4 days. 4 days back when games weren't software, they were hardware, chips. This was an unbelievable task. We actually did it. 4 days and nights. We both got mononucleosis. And it was so interesting. Steve said, how many chips do you think it'll take? And I told him, he said, well, if we get it to under 50 chips, we get $700, and under 40 chips, we get $1,000. And by the time the last night, I was so tired. It was I couldn't quite get the $1,000 bonus. But then I walked into a friend's basement where he was working on an electronics project, and he's typing away on a big teletype. Teletypes, most of you know, were these big machines that were like typewriters, and clunk, 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 and it could type back. And they plug into huge cables, and they cost a ton of money, more than even the small little computers that were going to be introduced soon. And he was typing on it. He said he was playing a game with a computer in Boston. And then he showed me, he said, watch this. And he interrupted it, and he brought up a list of colleges. And he said, I'll flip over to the computer at Santa Barbara. And now we were on Santa Barbara's computer, and they had a bunch of stuff for guests. And then he flipped over to Berkeley and Stanford, and it was the ARPANET, the early ARPANET. This was so amazing. It was like ham radio. You could reach out to faraway places and use things that were far away, and most people couldn't. It made you a little bit special in the world because ordinary folks couldn't do these magic things. So I said, I have to build a terminal. I know how to put dots on screens from my Pong game, so I'll just make the dots add up to letters of the alphabet. And I designed a little terminal. Now, I had no money, so there's no way in the world I could afford a video terminal. In those days, they might have cost $5,000. And I couldn't afford a teletype. That might cost $1,000 or two. And I didn't know where to get these things surplus. But I had a TV set at home, a Sears TV. And I thought, well, it's free. And that's what I had really designed my Pong game to work with. Anyway, so, and I snaked cables inside of it. Back in those days, every TV set, you talk about open and closed systems. In those days, every TV came with a schematic showing every part in it, and you could actually probe inside with oscilloscopes and find the video signal. And I pumped in my own video signal, and I built a terminal. But the key to this terminal was you need input and output. The input had to be a keyboard that a human being types on. And I searched the magazines at work and found one being offered for a special deal, $60 for a keyboard. That's probably like $500 today. So it was expensive, but it was affordable, barely. And I built this terminal and got it working with a modem, and I could call a number at Stanford and be on the ARPANET. And it was cool. I never really had much to do with those computers, but it was neat to be able to do it, to know you could do it. And Steve Jobs came along and he said, let's sell it. And we actually sold my terminals to a local time-sharing outfit. We sold a number of them. And then around that time, the Homebrew Computer Club started up. Only it wasn't called Homebrew Computer Club. It wasn't called anything with microprocessors. The friend that told me about it said a bunch of people from People's Computer Company are going to start this group, and it's for people who have terminals and things. Oh, I thought, oh, this is great. I'll be a standout. Because I was so shy back then, I couldn't really talk to people very much. But if I had something worthy to show them, that was how I communicated. So I could go in and say, I designed a terminal, and that was really neat. I could talk to people, I could help them build their own, whatever. And I went to this meeting and found out it was all about microprocessors and the first little computers, hobby computers, built around them. You'd buy a kit of parts and build a computer, and it had a square faceplate like all the computers before, like all the mini computers, with a bunch of switches and a bunch of lights, and it looked like an airplane cockpit, and boy, you had to know what you were doing to touch that thing. So, and this was called the Altair 8800, the Altair 8800, based on the Intel 8080 chip. And I didn't know what microprocessors were. For 3 years, I'd been doing calculators, and I had missed out on microprocessors. I was a hardware designer, not a software. So I was scared. I knew I was in the wrong place. I was over my head. I had done other things in my life. But I took home a data sheet that they passed out. And I went home and studied the data sheet. And this microprocessor had a bunch of instructions, one after another, after another, after another. And I said, oh my God, this is like those mini computers I used to design in high school. I'm back in business. That night, I realized how close I was to finally having the computer I'd wanted all my life. I wanted a computer with enough RAM to run Fortran. And I was close. I knew that I'd be able to afford it very soon. Well, I already had the input and the output because I had just built a terminal. And the terminal had a human keyboard and a television that displayed characters. So all I had to do was eventually, in my late at night at Hewlett-Packard, I'd go in sometimes and work till 2 in the morning, go down to Denny's and think about my designs on napkins. And I would design on my drafting table this computer based around, I couldn't afford the Intel chip, $400, that was out. But I found out I could buy, as an HP employee, I could buy a Motorola chip for $40, that was in. And then a new company introduced a really amazing processor. This new company was MOS Technology, and they introduced the 6502. And they were going to sell it for $20 over the counter at a show in San Francisco. So I went up to the WestCon show, and we paid our $20 and got the part. And we paid $5 more and got a manual. and took home and started studying this new little processor. To me, it was the latest, the greatest, and it did things that I liked in processors better than some. Some processors try to have the most instructions. We can do an add, we can do a multiply, we can do, more and more and more of these sorts of heavy physical things. This processor had very skimpy numbers of operations it could do that way, but it had addressing modes. It could look at memory, or it could look at a register that had an address and add something to it and get to a different memory address. And that's the way you can step through lists of things when you have these. It's called indirect addressing. My favorite computer architecture of all time was the IBM 360 model. They had a model where you could never specify in an instruction an address in memory. You could only specify it relative to a base register that held another address. And it was a very, very good scheme that made sure your program would work every time, wherever it was loaded in memory. I love that. So this processor had those features that I liked about processors. And it was pin for pin compatible with the Motorola processor I had started designing a computer for. Finally, eventually, you wait a week or two, you get a free weekend, a free night. I went in one night and I was ready, and I plugged in all the sockets into a board at Hewlett-Packard, and I started soldering them together, my design. What I did was I took my terminal and added the microprocessor, the 6502, and some RAM. I just used some simple to use static RAM. You run the address pins and the data pins to it, and it works. That's what everybody was using for all these hobby computers. Very simple. And I brought it up, and I had to do a little debugging, and I got it to work where I could type data in, and I could stuff it into memory, and I could examine what was in memory and see it on a computer screen. So I made incredible success very quickly. And then I started thinking, well, down at the Homebrew Computer Club, they were talking about the very first dynamic memories that were going to come out in the 4K size. The first time ever that memory chips on silicon were going to be cheaper than magnetic core memories. Magnetic core memories are those things you see in museums with little wires running through all these magnetic cores, and if you put signals onto two wires at once, the core that it hit could send back a signal if it was a 0 or a 1. And it was the memory scheme that every computer in the world used back then that was sold. This was the first time ever that chips were now being introduced in 1975 or 1976 that were going to be cheaper than core memories, which meant core memories were going to be the thing of the past very soon. Well, who wants dynamic memories? Dynamic memories have a problem. Every single bit inside of them forgets itself after 1/2000th of a second. It all goes away. The memories in your computer are built that way. Every single bit in your memories is lost in a 2,000th of a second, unless something reads it, figures out what the bit, and writes them back to refresh it to keep the data alive. Every 2,000th of a second, every bit in all of your RAM in your computers is being rewritten that way, because we use dynamic memories today. Well, it takes a lot of circuitry to do the reading and writing back in the old days. A lot of circuitry to make sure you're getting in there and getting to every single address while the computer's running, reading the data and writing it back to keep it alive. A lot of extra parts. But then again, these 4K chips were much better than the 1K static chips. 1/4 as many chips for the same amount of memory. If I wanted 4K bytes of memory, enough for a computer language, it would take 8 chips. But it took 32 of the older static, easier to wire memories, the 1K memories. It took 32 chips. I could cut that down to 8. I've saved 24 chips. What's my goal in design? The fewer the chips, the better. Not to mention the lower cost. So what if I have to design an extra 5 or 6 chips just to do the reading and writing to keep the chips refreshed with their memory? So I switched over to the dynamic RAMs, bought some from a guy in the club at a low price, because he worked at one of the 3 companies that were going to make them. And I got it to work, and then Steve Jobs said, why don't you use the Intel? Have you considered using the Intel dynamic memories? And I said, oh yeah, they got the best one of all. It's a little more complicated to use, but it's a better design, and it's TTL level. It matches the rest of my chips better. But the trouble is, it's Intel. It'll cost too much. And Steve said, well, what if I can get you some for free? I said, well, yeah, if you can get some for free, I'll build it in. And he got them for free, and I went to the Intel chips, and that was the dynamic memory that the next phase of dynamic memories a year later was going to be pin for pin, a copy of that chip, and up to the 16 case, the 64 case, the 256 case, on up the line to today's RAMs. It really came from that Intel chip. So it was very lucky that I had made that switch. Around this time, I was starting to build a little microprocessor device and talking about how I could even write a language. Now, I'd never taken a course in writing computer languages, and I didn't know how to do it, but I had thought about it a little in college, and I had some ideas, and I was ready to start. And remember, this was my life. This was the thing that I was trying to do for myself. You put a lot more time and energy into that than something that you're paid extrinsic rewards for that people can see. So Steve started saying things like, well, can you put a floppy disk on it? I said, someday you can. Someday you can. He's way, way ahead of me. He says, oh, can you even make it timeshare so multiple people can use it at once? Someday you can. Someday, Steve. I didn't say this is ridiculous, which is what I kind of felt, or so far out of what these chips are capable of doing, but so I just said, you could do it. Well, down at the Homebrew Computer Club, we were talking about a revolution where everybody in every home was going to have computers, and they were going to program them themselves and make them do things like control the home environments and the lights and everything, and that these people were going to be empowered. That a person, could do a certain amount of stuff, but if they had a computer and programmed it, they'd be doing stuff that none of their neighbors could do, and they'd be, running the world, and they'd go down to work with the big, huge computers the company owned, and they'd be doing more by writing faster programs, and little fifth graders would be writing better programs than the high-paid computer gurus. And we were going to overturn the world, almost overturn the rich and poor world, and poor people were just going to be more powerful even than the big, rich companies and the military, and we were going to enable people so much, be enabler and give them so much power. We also talked about once computers were teaching you over and over, they could repeat subjects and teach you that your minds were going to be 10 times the capacity of before. I was a little worried. I was thinking, whoa, some people are going to have computer minds. What are they going to be like? This world's going to be so different. Well, I don't know. Can't really tell the difference between a computer mind, but I guess we have it now. Well, had this neat little computer design that I started being able to show off at the club. I got this goal to write a computer language, and Bill Gates had come out with BASIC for the Intel chip. And I could sniff the wind, and I just knew BASIC was the best language for people because there were books full of games you could play in BASIC, and games were really the starting point. And BASIC was a nice, simple language and capable of everything Fortran was, the scientific language, and other languages. So I'd never programmed in BASIC in my life. But I sat down, opened up a Hewlett-Packard manual, learned a bit about the language, made my engineering notes, and started writing a program that would run BASIC. I mean, I'd never studied this sort of thing, so it was kind of lucky I stumbled on some good techniques. Sometimes if you're smart about the basic tools you're using, but you don't know how something's done, you'll find a good way there. You don't have to read a book and see how other people did it before you. So I wrote my BASIC language, and I started bringing it down and showing it at the computer club. And this was so open an atmosphere. It was a group a little larger than this, and I would put my Sears TV down on the keyboard and the board, and I started getting a crowd that would hover around me. So I would pass out schematics. See how you design a computer. See how to make a real simple one with almost no chips. I would pass out listings of the code as I wrote. I would give demonstrations of the BASIC. And it was pretty amazing to see one little board with a keyboard running a computer language on a TV. You couldn't do anything close to that in the hobby computers. You'd have to buy a computer and a whole bunch of RAM boards to plug into one of the 20 slots, and another board that snaked a cable off to a big, huge, expensive teletype that cost more than the computer, and you'd have to read in a paper tape for 20 minutes to get the BASIC in, and then you could type very slowly, and it was so far from what we call a computer today. So this was a big, huge step forward, and a lot of people were getting interested in the project. And Steve Jobs said, why don't we start a company to make a PC board to sell? We'll sell a PC board because these people have your schematic and they want to build it, but it's too much time. So what we'll do is we'll make a PC board. All they have to do is stuff the chips in, get the chips and stuff them in and solder it, and they'll be done in a day instead of in weeks of work. So, we'd have to spend so much money to lay out a PC board and pay a friend, and we'd have to, build them, and we had other expenses, and we'd have to sell about 50 of them to get our money back. And I didn't think we were going to sell 50 of them down at the club. I didn't think we'd get our money back. And Steve said, well, so what if we don't get our money back? We can just do it to have a company. Well, anybody who, like myself, who doesn't have to, things don't have to add up to numbers. You're doing it for fun. All my electronics projects. So anybody who's doing this stuff for fun would say, yeah, sure. As long as you don't have to go out and face the world and say, yeah, we expect to make money. We might make money. Sure. We have a good product. So eventually Steve went away for a little while and then came back from the orchard he worked on in Oregon. And on his return visit, he said, why don't we I got a great name, Apple Computer. The first thing I said was, what about Apple Records? And he said, well, that's a record company, so it doesn't matter. And I guess he knew, so. And we both tried to think of technical names for the company, but none of them sounded as good as Apple Computer. So there we were. It was great because there were all these little hobby computers that were kits of parts. And ours was sort of the most built one there was, the Apple one. But in all these magazines, they'd always list you in alphabetic order, so we were right at the top. And it was cute. We were getting noticed. We weren't making any money, but we were getting noticed by people all over the country. Even as we sold 10 computers, 20, 30, eventually we might have even sold 100 Apple ones. So, very, very small quantities, but it was kind of neat to be associated with something that was getting known. Well, when we first decided to start a company, I said, well, everything I design really belongs to Hewlett-Packard. And I said, so I've got to go to them. So met with all the people in my lab at Hewlett-Packard. I wanted Hewlett-Packard to do this. I loved that company. And we sat down with the lab manager and I explained how you could make a device about $800 that connects up to your TV set at home and runs BASIC. And the lab manager 3 levels above me was so torn by this idea that he told me for weeks after that, he'd say, I haven't been able to sleep since I heard that idea. It was such a compelling product, but it wasn't quite a Hewlett-Packard product. So I got turned down, and it was funny because later on, after we were selling Apple Ones, I got, full computers, and we had a company going. My lab started a project that had a little microprocessor for Motorola, and it had some dynamic memory, and it had 5 people working on the BASIC language, and it had printers and things and tape drives, all the stuff I had done for the Apple I. They were doing it with 20 people, and I went to the lab manager then, the new lab manager, or the project manager for that one, and I said, Chung, I really am tired of calculators. My life is computers. I want to work on this project. I waited 2 weeks and then found out I got turned down. And they wouldn't, even though I said, I'll do anything on it. I don't have to be in charge of it just because I've done it all. So, no, it's true. I really just wanted a job working on computers and couldn't get it. I actually had 3 total turndowns at Hewlett-Packard. Pretty amazing. Well, I got a phone call. We're gonna, if we sell our PC boards they cost us $20 to make, and we'll sell them for $40. And if we sell 50 of them, we'll get $1,000 back and recoup our money. And I got a phone call from Steve, and he said, "Are you sitting down?" Well, I sat on my lab stool, and he said, "I just got an order for $50,000. Okay, my jaw dropped. That was the biggest financial shock I ever got in all of Apple's history. $50,000. It's like we're actually successful. There was one store in the South Bay area, and that one store, the Bite Shop, wanted to buy 100 computers for $500 each because they didn't want to buy these kits, and their technicians would have to work day and night building up kits, and every time they had a kit built, they could sell it because people were walking in the store and wanted to buy completely built computers. Well, our computer was on one PC board, and we could wave solder, get all the parts inserted and wave soldered for $13. So that's basically completely built. You have to wire up a keyboard, a little TV monitor, and a couple of transformers for power supply. And that was it. So we were close to completely built. Not quite there yet with the Apple I. And we went off to a show, so we started selling these. And what would happen is we got a third partner. Steve had 45%, I had 45% of a partnership. And Ron Wayne typed out all the legalese in a partnership document right out of his head. He's one of those guys, and he was an ultra right winger. He read all these books, None Dare Call It Treason. He had his gold nuggets to save his money and all that. Steve was an amazing person. He drew a sketch of Newton under the apple tree. He etched it himself, and it was on the cover of our Apple I manual. I mean, really talented fellow. And then we worked out deals. Steve would go down to the distributors. We had no money to buy parts. So the distributors would give us the parts on 30 days credit. We'd quickly have them put into the PC board, soldered. We'd bring them to Steve's garage where we had one lab bench. And I would sit there with an oscilloscope and look at the signals. And, well, sometimes you turn it on and you type on the keyboard. It works. This one's good. Put it in the white box. And if they're bad, I would find out what pin was bent under or what was shorted and fix it and put it in the box. So we'd get through 25 of them or so, and Steve would drive them down to the bike shop in Palo Alto and get paid cash. Okay, and then we could pay off the parts, and we could cycle everything in 10 days, and we had 30 days credit on the parts. So, and then Steve was smart to hold out for the 30 days, and I didn't care about all that, but. And so we cycled everything in 10 days because we had no lawyers involved. And that's not really the reason, but it's a good thought. And so what happened was we would get the parts on credit, build the computers, deliver them, and get paid cash. What if the time came and we didn't get paid? We'd owe money. Steve had no money, and I had no money. We had no assets. We didn't have cars that we owned or homes or anything. So Ron Wayne was afraid they were going to come and get his nuggets from under his bed. So he sold out his 10% of Apple for a few $100. And we went on. Well, that was probably a good decision for him financially, risk. I mean, so around this time, a computer show in 1976 called PC 76 in Atlantic City. Might not be anyone in this room that was there, but it was a very important event. All these little companies, about 20 little companies that were offering computer kits that had, usually a couple of guys in jeans like me and Steve, just out of college or still in high school, and they somehow put together a kit and they were selling it. All these different companies, names like Sphere, and of course MITS was there, and a bunch. And so Apple was there. We went there. Steve and I flew, the first time I'd ever flown anywhere out of California except for Colorado for school. And this show was down in the basement of a hotel. It was a smaller room than this one right here, and everybody had a little table with their projects, and we'd go around and talk to each other and see that other people were into this business and knew microprocessors and RAMs and these sort of things, and believed that there was going to be a big, market for this stuff. And it was kind of dinky, if you think about it. And it's really funny because I was in a convention recently for the Segway project, and it was just like that. The Segway auto-balancing human transporters that you get on with two wheels and it balances you, and went to their first convention. It was just as humble, but this was the start of something really big, and we all felt so excited to be there in Atlantic City. Even by that point in time, a few months after we had shipped Apple I's, I actually had the Apple II designed and working. Somehow I sat down with an idea I'd come up with in an Atari lab for color, and a tricky way to get color out. You spin a binary number around, and what came out is ones and zeros. 1010, 1100, 1101, whatever comes out, turns out was coming out kind of like color TV signals. Sort of like them, but not textbook color TV. And sort of in the right frequency, but not textbook exactly, and sort of in differences in position, which is phase, and differences in level, which is like amplitude, but not exactly. Would this square wave come out on a color TV as color, or wouldn't it? Had no idea, but it was one little chip you spin around with a code in it. So I hooked it up to try it. I was going to build it into the Apple I, add it on, but then just started thinking about the Apple I and found ways to condense parts of the circuitry and overlap the two sets of memory, and things shrunk and shrunk and shrunk, and clever ideas for the timing for the dynamic RAMs. Instead of 5 chips, a 2-chip state machine approach, and then went through manuals all day for hours and found one chip that I could hook in special certain way, tying certain pins up a certain way, and that one chip would put out all the timing signals for the dynamic RAM. It needed a bunch of timing signals. Wow, was I ever making progress on getting things down to half as many chips as the Apple I, but it did more, and it had color built in from the start. When I first hooked it up to a TV set and I saw color, It was just so amazing. It worked. I don't know why the color in the Apple II worked, but it did. So thank God. Up until that time, somebody who knew about color had designed a board for the Intel computers. It was 2 boards, and each of those boards had more chips than the whole Apple II on it. Each one had about 50 chips on it, and those 2 boards from Krememco would give you color on some kind of special graphics monitor that cost $1,000. And here I had this one little chip putting out color into a normal color TV. So that was really exciting. And it was very easy to add. The Apple II had a bunch of advances that really nobody was doing in the whole rest of the hobby computer world. These kits were based around a certain microprocessor, the expensive and multiple static RAMs, switches and lights that cost money, and tons of wires and chips to receive them that could go bad and had to be soldered in, and you put it together yourself. They were big, messy contraptions. And this Apple II was so small and tight. And by then they were moving up to 2K ROMs, and we could put 4 of those in and have 8K a ROM, enough for basic language and more that I had written for the Apple I. So the Apple II took a lot of steps for the first time in small computers that really set a big note that was basically the standard that was going to be held forever. It had color. It had graphics. It had high resolution, meaning you could program the smallest dot that a home color TV could see. And it had a very optimal design with very few chips, but it had a lot of slots that were all ready to plug boards in. In the Intel computers, you had to plug a board in, dial in an address on the board, and they had to have a bunch of chips on the board to look for that address. I had done all that with 2 chips on the Apple II, decoded 8 slots twice. So it was like tons of advances. This was the first time a computer was going to be built that when you turned it on, it was running a language, BASIC, out of ROM. No data had to get read in from anywhere, not even from a disk. There was no disk on it. It would work with your cassette tape drive because that was free. It was the first time to build in. For some reason, I sat down one day and I said, you know what? They were at Atari, they were talking about programming microprocessors to make future games. And I thought, I wonder if this processor could be programmed to play a game like I had designed for Atari, Breakout. And then a very strange idea popped in my head. Basic language is much slower than what's called machine language in the microprocessor's language. But BASIC's easy to type in. I wonder if the BASIC could be fast enough to make a game like Breakout. And I didn't know. And I sat down and I told it to draw a bunch of pattern bricks in different colors, a couple little basic loops. Got all these bricks. I didn't like the colors on my TV set, so I changed the color code for a couple of them and got some colors I liked. And then I repositioned the bricks and changed the sizes, and then I built a ball and had the ball count out positions and detect when it was at the top and bounce and change its parameter, and it was wrong, and I debugged it and got it working. Then I played around with how fast do I want the ball to go? And then the paddle, how big should the paddle be? How many bounce directions should it have on the paddle? And programmed all that in about half an hour in BASIC. BASIC was so easy. And since I'd written the BASIC, I just put commands in the BASIC to draw color squares on the screen where I wanted them and to draw colored lines and stuff. So it was really good having written the BASIC and doing the hardware and writing this game. All 3 angles of it. It was good. Yeah, you have a lot more control than if it's 3 separate people. It's called multidisciplinary. So I called Steve Jobs over. And he came over, and I was shaking. I mean, I had that feeling inside, like you're hollow inside, and this is just so amazing. I said, Steve, this is playing Breakout. I said, the world of games is never going to be the same now that games are software. So we were right at the leading edge, of computers would be able to play games. And that was going to be a big time in the world compared to building games out of hardware, where it would take months to do. Oh, our Apple II also had 48 kbytes of RAM that you could plug into the slots on it. Now, had to come a decision to start a real company. This computer could sell 1,000 a month, but if they cost $250 each to build, you need $250,000 to build 1,000 Apple IIs. And we didn't have any money. And we talked to companies like Commodore, do you want to buy it? And they said, no, we're going to do our own. And we talked to Atari, and they were busy with the first Pong game for homes. And we talked to some venture capitalists, and I said, the market's $1 million because it's bigger than ham radio. And they said, well, that's not business talk. And we finally met Mike Markkula, who had retired from Intel on a stock option. And he was young, and he was actually out there making investments, but he was looking into electronics. And he liked what we had, and he always thought of a computer in the home too. And he and Steve started talking about the marketing issues, and he decided he would put in the $250,000. And part of it was to buy an equal share of stock to Steve and I, and part of it was a loan. So I had to leave Hewlett-Packard. And came the ultimatum day to make up my decision, and I went to Mike's Cabana and told him and Steve that, no, I like designing computers and I like writing software. And I want to work at Hewlett-Packard for my whole life because it's a good engineer company. And so I want the security. And the computers, I don't do it for a company, I do it for myself. And Steve kind of went into a frenzy, and he got my relatives to call me, my friends to call me. And one friend was very successful and said the right thing, that basically it's okay to be an engineer for life, and you don't have to go into managing and running this company you can start it and you can still have a right to be there and just to get rich. So I left Hewlett-Packard that day. Now that I was convinced that it would be acceptable to be an engineer and nothing else, because I did not want to step on people's toes and be political and run companies and all that stuff. Well, when we first started, we had our computer, and very shortly, Commodore and Radio Shack introduced ones that had either no graphics or crappy graphics, lousy clicking keyboards. They did use dynamic RAMs, which kept the cost down. They had more chips inside than we had. They were black and white only. You had to pay for their monitor, and they didn't have the high resolution, and they didn't have paddles and sound and all these neat things we had in the Apple II. And they were stuck with 4K or 8K bytes of RAM. That's it. No way to expand. They had no slots to plug more electronics in to make things like floppy disks. So we all were out there, and we were all kind of selling in different places. The Apple was by far the best computer. Apple, Commodore, Radio Shack. The Apple was by far the best, but it cost the most. We wanted to price it sort of high so that we could expand the company and grow the company and not run out of money, and so we kept our price pretty high. Well, it came a certain point in time when VisiCalc got designed, the first spreadsheet ever. And also, Mike Markla said, you know what, we've got to make our checkbook program work a little faster than cassette tape. We've got to go to a floppy disk. And I went down and did one of the favorite designs of my life, a 2-week stint over Christmas vacation, got a floppy designed, and it just came out beautiful. Those two things made this product so valuable, but neither one of them could have been done on the Radio Shack or the Commodore computers, because VisiCalc took more than 4K of RAM. And a floppy disk needed an operating system, and that took more than 4 or 8K of RAM. They didn't have enough RAM. They didn't have the hardware slot to make the hardware for a floppy disk in the Commodore. So both of them had to go back to the drawing boards, and that gave us like a year lead. And pretty much the small businessmen discovered a little computer that was affordable and a spreadsheet program, and boy, I can just revolutionize my business. And the market started swinging heavily in the business direction. Well, inside of Apple, Steve especially would get very excited, about, we always had to cover the next angle. We always had to have the next product. We had to move, we had to have something new every single month. And Mike Markla was a little more relaxed like I was. We have a good product, we have good people, we'll design the best thing, in the time it takes. But we got going right away on a business machine. And it would be basically an Apple II with only 2 slots for a printer and a modem. And it's really funny because back in the Apple II, Steve had said, we should only have 2 slots, printer and modem. And I said, no, we got to have 8 slots. And he said, people always come up with things to plug into slots. And he said, no, all you need is 2, printer and modem. And I said, well, then go get another computer. So that solved that one. And actually, my reason for doing it wasn't knowing what the slots would be used for. It was, I had a clever design with 2 chips decoding 8 slots twice. And I didn't want to give up that greatness. So now we have the Apple III, and it only had 2 slots, and we had a lot of problems. We sort of we sort of were really proud of ourselves and thought we could do everything in the world. And we decided there were 5 key pieces of software. VisiCalc would be written on the outside, and we would write the other 4 inside. When the Apple III came out, the only one that was done was VisiCalc, written on the outside. And we thought we could build any sort of hardware with any sort of rules, and we had PC boards that crackled and broke, and the traces were too thin, and the sockets of the chips the pins of the chips didn't stay well in the sockets, and they would have to drop the computer to make it work. And the dealers, my brother was a dealer, and he was so upset because he had this brand new computer that everybody had been lining up for and being put off for, and if he sold it to them, it came back not working, and Apple couldn't replace it with one that would work. And so what did every dealer in the country do? They couldn't sell it. They stopped selling it. So the Apple III was pretty much dead on arrival, even though Apple kept after it for 3 years. It had no software yet, and if you flip the switch to the Apple II position, it would boot up as a complete Apple II and at least be an Apple II that could run Apple II software, except that we put extra chips in to disable some of the features. So you wouldn't think that an Apple II was that capable. That was marketing. That was a marketing idea. That the Apple III, no, the Apple II is for home hobby and the Apple III is for business. So there were a lot of things you could fault about the Apple III, but most of all, I think it's the fact that the company stayed with it so long. Every employee, 3 years later, every employee at Apple had an Apple III on their desk. Everyone was working on Apple III projects, still trying to recover it and make it go. Now, Apple III had another problem that came along. Even when we fixed it a year later, IBM was introducing their first PC. IBM already had salespeople into all the top corporations that could buy IBM computers. And all they had to do was anything on the IBM price list they were allowed to buy. So it was so easy for managers and IT managers in companies to just simply buy some IBM PCs. And the Apple was much harder to buy. So IBM was really taking over the insides of businesses. And the Apple III didn't have as equal a starting point. Well, Steve Jobs was looking around and the same time, and he heard from a couple of our employees about this work at the Xerox PARC Center that was going to become the Lisa and the Macintosh, the GUI operating system. We went down there and we saw windows and mouses and menus pop up, and it's like you were just seeing something so beautiful and wonderful in the world that once you saw that, you knew that once you had it, you'd never go back to the old, where you have to run programs or type in lines just to copy files. And so we saw that, and there were a lot of dreams inside of Apple. You see, we figured we were the ones who could make this technology available to the masses. Our dreams were this software is going to be so friendly, so helpful. It's not like a computer that's cold and impersonal, but like a friend helping you out. And that it was going to be so productive, the steps you could take. It was so much easier sometimes to drag things than to type in huge long commands that you had to memorize and make mistakes on. And this computer was intuitive. You just sit down with it and look at it and figure out what to do. We spent a long time testing and testing and testing. How many menus? What should the words in the menu be? What should the order be? What should the menu items be? And how should the close button be implemented? And how about the growing the window sizes? All this stuff. We worked and worked and worked to make it as natural as possible with people who had never used a computer, which was something that Jeff Raskin had brought into our company. And that all the programs would be very consistent. If you learned one program with a set of menus, you'd run another program, and a lot of those menus would be the same. You've already learned how to do them, so you don't have to relearn. All these beautiful dreams and ideas we were bringing to the world. And for some reason, you'd think the world would have caught on to that. Some things in your life, like music. You know, if I tell you there's a certain song out and it's really good and you're going to like it and so-and-so's in it, you don't really know if you're going to like it until you get home and hear it. You have to hear things to feel them inside. You have to have a feeling. So you almost had to see and feel and touch this Lisa Macintosh idea to be close enough to see how incredibly good it was. And those in the Intel side had been excluded in a sense. And they almost felt like they were excluded from the time the first Lisa and Macintosh came out. Around this time, the Macintosh got started. I was on the team and I had a plane crash. Decided I'd go back and I'm going to finish college. Because it's important to me to tell my kids, what college I went to and I graduated. And so I'm one of the few computer people that actually finished college. I actually loved psychology so much and education and young kids that I all got distracted into a lot of psychology for majors courses at Berkeley and almost didn't graduate still in electrical engineering. Well, while I was still away from Apple, I decided to put on a couple of big music festivals because I thought, you know what, there's nobody else in the world that would do this. And at those music festivals, we did a technology demonstration. We set up the first space bridge ever, video link with satellite, to the Soviet Union. It was very uncertain whether we could do this or not. Basically, NBC had taken over a bunch of equipment to the Soviet Union for an Olympics that we pulled out of, and the equipment was still over there. And some technicians in the Soviet Union that we had contacts with got that equipment out and able to set it up and try to make a satellite link. And on the day of the satellite link, we had to arrange with the president of GTE to get a phone connection to Russia, because normally you had to wait 2 weeks back then to get a phone call. And somehow, by some miracle, the video worked and it came through on our screen. And Bill Graham was supposed to go up to the microphone and announce to the audience what it was, a historic event, live video to the Soviet Union with one of their bands and one of our bands playing, Eddie Money and Joe Chirino we had. So I ran across the stage and there's Bill Graham. He's pointing at a bunch of monitors. He says, "This is coming from Southern California." And he just didn't believe it was real. So I had to go up to the microphone and announce it. And we did others. We did the first 3 space bridges. The next 2 we did were people to people, people in a tent on our side with an astronaut, talking to people over there with a cosmonaut, and sharing stories and asking questions. And I got really affected. I sort of realized those people have the same wants and desires, and they think about the same things we do. They like the same music. And you know what? They really aren't. We've been brought up by the government to kind of see them as a big enemy, and they would all hate us. And then once they talk to us, they could see we aren't any enemies that hate them. We just want to have a good life just like you. And so it really, grabbed me a lot with the fact that, boy, once you meet people face to face, it really tears apart a lot of, what you've been built up with, a lot from propaganda. So eventually ABC put on what they called the first space bridge to the Soviet Union. It was really the 4th one. And I even paid the expense of the satellite link on that one, and they didn't give me any credit. They claimed to be first, but I was. So I got involved with a lot of Soviet Union people-to-people activities, letting Soviets travel around the country and stay in Rotary Club people's homes, and normal people, not the prestigious ones. And eventually the perestroika was on and the coup came, but they were getting so much they wanted to be like us by then whenever I went over there. Apple came out with the 1984 ad to introduce the Macintosh. And I went over to the Macintosh building one night. Steve called me over and he said, "Look at this, watch this." And I watched it. Oh my God, it was like the most incredible science fiction piece, like better than you could ever see on Star Trek. And I said, "Oh, that is so incredible." And he said, "Well, we probably aren't going to show it on the Super Bowl." I said, "Well, why?" And he said, "Well, one of the reasons was it cost $800,000. So I figured that the board didn't want to spend $800,000. So I looked at Steve, I said, "I'll pay half of it if you will." I was so naive, I didn't realize it was a political issue there with that ad. And eventually we did show it, thanks to our PR team. So I remember the first time I finally got Macintoshes. I didn't switch over right away. I still used my Apple IIs, and my Apple IIc was my favorite little portable device, and used that to develop code for some remote controls I was working on and some other Macs for other things. But the first Macs, I think I remember playing that game Frogger. I didn't get into as many of the games as most people, but then the SE came out, and it had a disk drive built in, a hard disk, the hyperdrive. And boy, I set up our company back then, and we got these all linked together, and we all had laser writers we could print to, and we had disk drives now, and we had little in-the-house email, and this was really cool. So from then on, it's kind of been Macintoshes for me. And the laser writers would hook up with this technology called Apple Talk, later called Local Talk, and it was so cool because you could look in a chooser, and a printer would show up there. We have Rendezvous now in OS 10. But it's really like all the Macintosh operating system before that. The chooser always showed you printers that were there. It was so much nicer than what the Unix world had and the PC world, where you kind of had to set up, you couldn't really do this networking to printers anyway on PCs. So I thought, boy, you know what? I really want to wire my house. So I hooked up the house. I managed to get, we had local, I didn't want to use Local Talk, but they came out with PhoneNet. Everybody remember PhoneNet? You just plug in your phone outlets and the unused wires are carrying the signals. So I got this big repeater thing and I ran to all the phone lines throughout my house, or every room had a PhoneNet connection you could plug into, and you could print to the laser writer. And it was just so cool. And my young little son, I think he was about 7 or 8 then, he said, my New Year's resolution is never print, only print on, no, that was when we went to Ethernet, sorry. So we're on Local Talk, printing to the laser writer, and it takes a little while. And eventually, then we went to Ethernet. And back then, Apple had this connector, and you had to put thin lead in, these little black coax wires, and one would come out of the wall and go into this connector, and another one would go back into the wall and go to the next connector over, the next room, and the next room, and the next room, and they're all chained together. A very complicated, messy, difficult system, especially when squirrels chew the wires. And if anything goes wrong anywhere, any break in the system, it kills everybody. The very end of the wire has to be terminated with a terminator, or the electrons will bounce back and forth and mess everything up with signals, overlapping signals. And we got it to work. And then my son came to me one morning and he said, my New Year's resolution is only print with Ethernet. It was so much faster. So, around then, I got my son under his first Macintosh, and I would answer questions for him. And he would ask, where do you do this? And I'd show him, and how do you do that? And after a little while, sometimes I'd be stuck with something on my computer I wasn't figuring out, and he'd say, oh, it's right there, Dad. So all of a sudden, in about a year time, he was answering more of my questions than I was answering of his. And I thought, oh boy, this world's passing me up. Yeah, we moved into things like, we got finally into the RJ45 type Ethernet. We moved into quadras back in those days in the house. I'd get down on my hands and knees and tear out the hard disks and put in better hard disks, And there's all these SCSI connectors. We learned this word SCSI, never knew what it meant. I don't think I still know what it means. And you had to have all these terminators, and sometimes they wouldn't work, and you just unplug things and plug them and hope it works again. And so went through some very painful days. That was the first time in my life I ever said I'm going to give up computers permanently. I am just dead tired of this. And eventually they even came out with gigabyte hard disks, man. Those were big days back then. And I remember when remote access hit. And, I didn't quite know, what is this? You can phone into a computer, like Apple Talk style or something. And I had 2 computers in my office, and I set one up on a phone line and the other one on another phone line. I had it dial in with this remote access program. I ran remote access on both computers, and I dialed in, and it said, I'm connected. And I went to the chooser on my laptop, and it said, or whatever the second computer was, I went to the chooser, and it showed up the other hard disk of the other guy. And I said, oh my God, I'm on my home network. This is just unbelievable, this remote access. It actually works. What you really like about computers is when you try something new and you expect it to fail, and it works without having to solve it. I've got a few of those good experiences. I remember the first iBook I got with Airport, the first Airport Hub, and it just worked. Man, I'll tell you, when you get a technology and it works for you right off the bat the first time, you'll stick with it for a decade. So, we got the house all, into hubs and at that point in time. And then the first laptop came out. Not the laptop, but the big, whatever they called it, the portable. And the what? Well, it was like the Osborne, but it was like a suitcase. But you know what? It was a Macintosh that would fit in an airplane. It would fit in an airplane. You couldn't use it on the airplane, but it fit, and I'm one of the few people that actually liked it. I was glad for that. And because I'd carry my Macintosh with me, and the other form factor was heavier and much more awful. And it was kind of a neat computer because you opened it up and it was on. The RAM was static RAM, and it was just always kept and maintained, and there was no having to come out of a sleep mode or anything. So it was really kind of good. Well, around that time, I had started sort of tutoring my one son, and then I started tutoring a goddaughter in the area because she was having school problems, and I really enjoyed teaching kids and working with them on using a computer to write stories and space things and choose fonts and that sort of stuff. So I decided, I think I'll try setting up a little class. I was giving lots of computers to the school district already for their different schools and for their labs and all that, and I'll start a class. So I started a class with some local 5th graders. There's only one class of 5th graders at the local school, and I only took 6 of them at first. First day of class, what do you do first? You get a screwdriver and you unscrew the hard disk. And it's just, every single class I felt it was really important for the kids to take things apart, hold them in their hands, put them back together, and kind of know that it's not that scary a world inside. And we also started working on learning base too. But in later years, I kind of skipped that step. AOL was fresh. AOL was Macintosh only. Probably a lot of you remember that. And I got an AOL account and I said, you know what, part of my class, in my computer class, I said the most important thing is that the students learn not how to have fun with their computer, but how to make good schoolwork, how to turn in good reports. Make them look so good that the teacher thinks that they're smarter than they are. And the teacher will act like they're smarter to them and act like they know stuff. And you know what? They'll start to feel it and feel that they know stuff and want to be that way. So it's a positive feedback circle. And so I wanted to be a little part of that and at least help them be able to use this new and important educational tool. But I also wanted reaching out to the rest of the world. AOL was the first place you could wind up talking to people in chat rooms that lived in other states, because these kids didn't really have access to long distance phones or anything. And this was just an important part of life. So I bought AOL accounts for all the kids in the class, and networking, understanding how networks work and packets of data, and even wiring up Ethernet in the classroom, hooking it together. That was always part of my class, even to 5th graders. And the rest of the class was how to maintain your computer and fix problems. And we had a lot of reliability problems, a lot of breakages. 30 computers. At the end of a year, we'd have had 100 breakages and send them back to Apple, get them repaired. When you carried those computers around, the way you should carry laptops around, they can only take so much. Well, my father died, and at the funeral, Steve Jobs came up and told me how these guys at Stanford had stretched what was called a T1 line. I'd never heard of it. A T1 line to his house. And he got internet, real high speed. And I said, man, I've heard this internet's really great. And so after hearing that, I found a friend that knew a friend that came in and taught me how you buy the pieces from a phone company and from an internet provider, and how you basically get what you need to run a whole internet in your place and get a T1 line. So I ran it down to my office. I got a T1 line, and I hooked up I hired this little consulting company, and they set up a server, a Sun machine, because you had to use a Sun. Macintoshes were starting to claim they were committed to the internet, and they had an internet server you could buy, and I bought it. And the trouble is, it didn't come with any internet software. So it was kind of like I bought a Macintosh server once that was a pure file server, and it came with a tape drive and retrospect to back up, but retrospect wouldn't work with that model tape drive. And I never even got it rectified by Apple, believe it or not. So things aren't always what they seem. So anyway, we set up an email in my office, and I was in such early days of the internet, I was able to get a 3-letter .com, woz.com, and I got woz.org, and I figured I'm kind of an org type person, so I'll use woz.org. So I'm Steve at woz.org. And we had a Cisco router. I started hearing the word router for the first time, and some mysterious, only a few people can program these routers that know how to do it. Well, our school district around that time started heading off. So we had a web server. First of all, I had a web server, and I learned how web pages are made, and you go in and modify parts of them, and it changes things. And Netscape was out. Netscape 1.0 and then 1.1. You probably remember those days. And I set up an email system, and it was all running on the Sun, but I really wanted to get it on a Macintosh. Our local school district decided to go with 3Com routers. So I switched over to 3Com routers, and I still use them to this day. And eventually, the Macintosh had Mac DNS, which tells the world where your computers are at your domain name, woz.org. And Mac HTTP was a web server software, and now WebStar. And then There was a thing called AIMS, and now it's EAMS, but AIMS was Apple Internet Mail Service. It was a complete email system. Finally ran the whole thing on a Macintosh. I was so dedicated, I had to do that. I don't think I knew very many other people, even at Apple, that did that as early as you could. This was working out so well. Got a T1 installed to my home, and in class, we got guys that would come down from the company Netscape and teach my class how to use the browser Netscape. But at home, the very first thing I ever bought, there weren't many things being sold on the internet yet. You could see the astronomy pictures from NASA, and you could see a few little academic type things, but there wasn't much commerce on the internet yet. So my wife and I searched one night, and we found coffee, because the search engine was Yahoo. That was the search engine for Netscape back then. And we found coffee in Hawaii, and we ordered some, and it actually came eventually. So I thought that was kind of cool. My very first internet purchase. I don't even remember the day, 90 something, 90, 91. Well, around those were the days when you had integrated software like Microsoft Works, but it kind of didn't work with one of the operating system upgrades, I think System 7, so from then on it was Apple Works, and so even though, I mean, we lost the lawsuit, so we gave it to the world, I guess. I remember the first PowerBook came out, the first time I could actually take a computer to bed at night and use it, and even plug it into Local Talk and be on the internet. And the Duo, that was my favorite. To this day, I don't know, that Duo just changed my life so much. That computer was everywhere I was. Really liked things nice and small. And the PowerBook 500 series was kind of nicely styled, but it sort of dropped behind the standards of what had to be on a laptop in the Intel world. And the 5300 actually picked up to what a laptop should have in terms of PCMA slots and SCSI and other things, but it had its own problems. As a matter of fact, every single one of my 5300s had a lot of problems that year. The Newton. The Newton ruined my life. Because everybody, I see a lot of people that are real productive with their PDAs now, and I can't go to any of these PDAs because the Newton was so good. It worked the way I worked. If I went to, yeah, I know it still is, I should pull out, I got a couple of unopened MessagePad 2100s. They'll see their day. But I would take notes. I would take notes at meetings at school and meetings in classes. And if my brain works a real simple way. My brain comes up with an idea, Sarah, dentist, Tuesday, 2 p.m. And now my brain can do a lot of work and start translating that into get your calendar program, and then click to the right date, and then click something to add a new item, and then pick a category and type in a name, and click a category and type in what it's for, and type in where and when. You know what? You can do all that clicking, but my brain really thought of the words that I would speak out of my mouth, which are Sarah, dentist, Tuesday, 2 p.m. So on the Newton, I would write that. Sarah, dentist, Tuesday, 2 p.m. It clicked this little assist button, and it would completely bring up the calendar filled in correctly. I might, at the worst case, I might have to choose between two different Sarahs. And it was, so that's the way I work. When I took messages on the phone, I would just handwrite, call Jim, that quickly, assist, and beep, 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 beep. It would call him and be taking the notes while I'm on the conversation. So that whole idea of the Newton just getting down to the way people's minds work, it's such a simple technique, and it's never really come back. I think one of my best towers of all time in the Macintosh world was the 8500. That machine, it had video in and out, and it just worked and worked and worked, and I'm still using those things as servers to this day. So I like it when a machine goes a long time, because we have too many cases where your machine just gets outmoded and obsolete and doesn't work anymore, and the software doesn't really attend to it and still out of date. But that one went the longest time. In the PowerBook world, I remember the PowerBook 1400 came out. Some of you might remember you got to stick your own little colored slides on the cover of it and have your own customized pictures, which was cool. And the keyboard typed so well. I loved that computer. That was a nice little light one. I still keep my 1400 to this day. Well, in the times of Gil Amelio, a lot of people complained that, the Macintoshes were kind of uninteresting. They were just stock computers, and they were just nothing special about them. The funny thing is, it was the educational computers were actually making money still. but they didn't really get accredited. The education, there were people in the company that really didn't want to attend the K-12 education. Gil's was basically cutting back. There was all this horrible publicity. Is Apple going to live? Is Apple being forced out of school districts, being forced out of companies? All that horrible publicity. So Gil was busy reorganizing, cutting out projects and changing, cutting down from multiple buildings to fewer buildings to save money. And it was kind of a thankless job. Even the first Macintosh was actually already on the way. I mean, the first iBook, sorry, the iMac. So anyway, Steve came back and brought with him sort of a flavor that comes from the fans of, we are special and we want to have that feeling that we have special and that we have something better and we're willing to pay even a little more, but we don't want to be left like just one of the crowd, just like the PCs. So that whole feeling came back. I mean, I loved my cube. That's another one I miss. Well, today, where do we sit today? It's funny, but computers haven't been changing a lot in the last decade. I want to say 2, but not really. What I do with my life on the computer is pretty much the same. And I know that the next computer that I'm going to buy is going to be a Macintosh. And how many of you are going to buy a Macintosh next? How many are going to buy a PC next? Pretty much there's this heavy grouping that you're in a group of the computer that you know and use and you're going to buy. And in that sense, Apple, as well as Microsoft, is a monopoly. They have our business. Whatever they put out, however lousy the software is or doesn't do what it's supposed to do, all we can be told is, well, that's what it is. We don't really choose our computer based upon its qualities even. So the quality, of software, you'd expect to suffer a little. And I think it has over time. I think a lot of the early Macintosh dreams, especially things all working the same way and consistently expecting when you click on something, does it make it active right away? Does it start a drag or does it not? Nothing's the same anymore. What Apple does have is certainly superior hardware to the Wintel world. The materials that are chosen, from the aluminum casing, the titanium was really astounding. The styling of the lines, of hiding things, of keeping small shapes, of making things look sleeker than they are. The accessibility and ease of getting things in and out of whether it's desktops or laptops. I'm thinking like when you open up your tower door to get to the insides, I mean, it's just like the best structure that was ever done. And the rest of the world had missed that by. We've got the best processor now, the G5, and very often we have that feeling of having a better processor inside. And the ports, we're just always the leader on our advanced models, having the most advanced ports, quicker than the Wintel world, and moving up to airport first and 802.11b, the faster airport even sooner than the others. Building in Bluetooth now, 1 gigabit Ethernet, where you don't even have to worry about is your wire a crossover or not. It always automatically switches and it's so extremely fast. FireWire 1 and 2 and USB 1 and 2. So we've always been kind of a leader with having the latest, greatest hardware, but sometimes we drop things people want. Why did you take out the second port here? Why did you take out SCSI? Well, sometimes you got to look at the trade-offs and say the trade-offs in general are very good for Apple to save money but give functionality. The operating system, well, OS X, in my opinion, is reliable and durable, but I don't think it really made Apple. I don't think it was needed. I told that to Steve once, and he actually agreed. He said, but he had to, I said Apple shouldn't have paid $400 million for it, and he said, yeah, but he had a duty to the shareholders the next. And we didn't. There was a feeling that Mac OS 9 was very unreliable and would crash a lot. And it's unfortunate because it's partly true. But if you didn't use Internet Explorer, you could go 2 weeks without a crash. Well, there's a lot of people that think it's a joke, but I accidentally switched to iCab. And I didn't have a crash that day. I didn't have a crash the next day, and I'm wondering what the heck happened. Because these crashes would occur opening a folder in the Finder, and they went away. Somehow not running Internet Explorer was it. So I had a few friends that claimed they never had crashes, and I always thought they were just lying, or they're restarting, every hour. And I asked them what browser they use, and they used Netscape, the ones that never had crashes. So that was a pitiful thing to know. But people wouldn't switch away from Internet Explorer back then. Well, the apps, the iApps, I don't even have to comment on how the iApps are laid out with very unbusy, very few little things you can click that do cover such a wide range of activity. And then we talk about this integration. Okay, my job in designing the early Apples was very multidisciplinary. I decided on what I was going to build, chose some chips to use. I designed it on paper, copied it onto a nice drafting board, and then I got out a board and picked positions for the chips and plugged them in and soldered every single wire and tested it with scope, plugged the chips in, tested it, made changes, debugged it, changed around, wrote some software, did it all. I eventually on the floppy disk even designed the PC board. And when I could save 3 holes, I redesigned the whole circuit and relayed it out so I could save 3 holes on the board. And it was like you cross all these different arenas. Well, Apple's always kind of done that well. We've always said we make the hardware and the software, and it gives us more ability for the two to work together as a team than if we just designed one of them with specs. I don't know that I always believe that, but when I look at .Mac, probably a lot of you in here don't have .Mac, don't really know, but some of the apps in iPhoto, you'll see a home page button and you click on it, and if you have .Mac, it publishes your selected photos on a web page and gives you the URL to it. It is so easy, it's one click. And if you don't have that, you've got to output things as a web page and upload them to some server and learn all this geeky stuff that really, human beings don't really want to deal with. So it's the whole idea of when you have a computer out there doing work for you, servers that are at your disposal for email, for web servers and all that, and you have your own computer in here with its programs for music and files and photos and movies and all, and you have the operating system and the computer, and they're all built by the same company. They can all work together a lot more harmoniously. And Apple does a good job with that, and more the world's going to find out that's a huge advantage for Apple. Obviously, as users, we all feel that we're the special ones. We're the chosen ones. We've got the Macintosh. We know why it's so good. And those who don't, who cares? Let them go. It's kind of like Harley Davidson. There's a lot of people out there. They're going to buy a Harley Davidson, and that's all they're going to consider. So it's like those two companies have this kind of special magic that people won't give up on them. The last comment I'm going to make today is something on business models related to, what you see a lot in the business we're in. And I'm only going to just discuss a few little aspects briefly. First of all is when you buy something, sometimes you only get part of the solution. You buy a computer and then you get told, oh, you got to buy .Mac to really have it complete. Or you buy some other product and find out, oh, you really want to buy this extension for it, or an extra battery, or whatever. And it's kind of like you get sucked in and then you really find out that what you want is really more, and you wind up spending more money. And unfortunately, that works in our system very well. Another one is closer to deceit. It's like the way you buy a printer and it comes with a half of an ink cartridge, and then after a while, you go and print a few documents one day, a few copies of a 70-page document, and you've gone through $75 worth of ink you have to buy to replace it. You start to figure out this printer seems so cheap. It's just $100. It was free. And really, it's a very, very, very expensive printer. And it's almost like somehow we get set up to try to trick people into, you can get a very cheap cell phone and a very cheap first rate, but then after a while you add up all your monthlies forever and you're paying a lot of money. Also, the automobile industry was always accredited with planned obsolescence, where vehicles wouldn't last beyond a certain number of years so they could get more sales. We don't really have that much of that in our case. Maybe we have batteries that go bad. I don't know, batteries in laptops go longer than about 1 to 2 years. But we've gone beyond that, and we have something that's more like forced obsolescence. If you force people to have to change to a new port or a new camera card, all of a sudden it's more money. If you force them to have to upgrade to USB or to go to FireWire, it's like more money to buy the newer product that has those. So those are some of the lessons of the modern business world. And that does it for me today. And I'm going to hang around and talk to people that want to and answer questions privately and individually about any subject. But I think we've probably gone long enough here. So thank you so much.